So we move into chapter 2, which Richard Dawkins has titled The God Hypothesis. And the very first sentence of the chapter starts out that the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. And in a few pages, he's going to quote Gore Vidal that says, 3 anti-human religions have evolved: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. These are the sky god religions. They are literally patriarchal. God is the omnipotent father, hence the loathing of women for 2,000 years in those countries afflicted by the sky god and his earthly male delegates. And this brings us back to Aristotle's comment that we determine what is true not by pure intellect alone, but also with the influence of our ethos, our emotions. And again, I would find Dawkins' argument more convincing if he was not so clearly emotionally biased against it. And I cannot help but wonder how Dawkins' strong feelings on the subject affect his ability to come to the correct conclusions about the evidence relating to God. Now, Dawkins says at the beginning of the chapter here, this book will advocate the alternative view. Any creative intelligence of sufficient complexity to design anything comes into existence only as the end product of an extended process of gradual evolution. And this is the crux of his argument throughout the entire book, that anything of complexity must start out simple and slowly evolve into something more complex. Therefore, according to Dawkins, even the idea of God is possible as long as he is an evolved God. Now, the flaw in this logic could be easily pointed out by observing that Dawkins, by this logic, would believe in ghosts, but only if they were evolved ghosts that started out as simple single-cell ghosts and gradually evolved over time into more complex ghosts. And of course, that is just silly, but that is what happens when you take a principle from the natural world and you try to apply it to the supernatural world where it has no relevance. The principle simply does not fit across the board as Dawkins would have us believe. Now, Dawkins makes an interesting comment when he says Buddhism or Confucianism, indeed, there is something to be said for treating these not as religions at all, but as ethical systems or philosophies of life. And that made me wonder, why the free pass? You see, back on page 35, Dawkins defined naturalism and atheism this way. An atheist, in this sense of philosophical naturalist, is someone who believes there is nothing beyond the natural physical world. And Buddhism does believe there is a spiritual force beyond the natural physical world, but merely that it is impersonal. So it seems that what Dawkins has a problem with is not the idea of something beyond the natural physical world, but the idea that anyone or anything could have any right to dictate anything to him as the personal God of Christianity, Judaism, or Islam would. And again here we see Dawkins' preconceived notions. Now, he goes off on a rabbit trail here talking about the secularism of the founding fathers of America, and he tries to make the point that America's founding fathers were secular because the U.S. Constitution is void of any reference to God. And I find that kind of logic, well, quite poor, and I'll tell you why. This is the instructions how to assemble and disassemble my Benelli shotgun. And nowhere in here is there any reference to God or Scripture. So by Dawkins' logic, I must conclude that the engineers at Benelli are all atheists because they didn't put any biblical reference in the instruction manual. Well, that's just absurd. And so was Dawkins' point about the Constitution, which is an instruction manual how to run a country and not a theological work, and therefore not surprising at all that it does not contain any scriptural references. So Dawkins' point is a little misguided at best. Plus, the Declaration of Independence is full of theistic references, saying that we are endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights, that the nature's God has entitled America to freedom, and at the end of the document, they appeal to the supreme justice of the world to evaluate the integrity of their intentions. So there is good evidence that the founding fathers did have faith. And again, it's just kind of a silly rabbit trail that Dawkins throws into this chapter. But getting back more to the meat of the atheism-theism discussion, in the section titled The Poverty of Gnosticism, Dawkins says the question of extraterrestrial life is open. Good arguments can be mounted both ways. And I find it fascinating that he is entirely open to the possibility of little green men from Mars, but entirely closed off to the idea of a God. When, in fact, there's more evidence that Israelites were slaves in Egypt and miraculously delivered from Pharaoh's powerful army than there are of little green men in Roswell, New Mexico. It seems to me he doesn't apply the same standards of evidence to the discussion of extraterrestrial life as he does to the question of the existence of God. But this next statement here is where I like to camp for just a minute because it is so full of meaning. Dawkins says, if he, meaning God, existed and chose to reveal it, God could clinch the argument noisily and unequivocally in his favor. And that is true, and yet so packed with meaning. You see, Dawkins spends 19 pages discussing how offensive he finds God as described in the Bible. And then he goes on to say that finding a fossil rabbit in the Precambrian rocks would absolutely convince him of God's existence. But even though that rabbit would change his belief on God's existence, would it rewrite the Old Testament or change his feelings about God's character? You see, it would only convince him that the God that he hates and loathes, the God that he believes is a psychotic delinquent, does in fact exist. The kind of evidence that Richard Dawkins wants is the worst possible evidence because it would leave him convinced of a tyrannical, despot, delinquent God. Perhaps that's why C.S. Lewis said, "The irresistible and the indisputable are the two weapons which the very nature of God's scheme forbids him to use. Merely to override a human will as his felt presence in any but the faintest and most mitigated degree would certainly do, would be for him useless. He cannot ravish, he can only woo." See, the question is, does God want a loving relationship with humanity, or does he want a subservient master-slave relationship? And if he does exist, how could he undisputably prove that to us without destroying our ability to make a choice regarding him. And this was a dilemma that Soren Kierkegaard attacked with the analogy of a powerful king that fell hopelessly in love with a maiden. And he wanted to know if that maiden might return his feelings of affection. But he knew that he could not approach her as the king, because he would never know for sure her genuine feelings toward him. For surely she would feign attraction even if she loathed him for fear of her life. So the king did the only thing that he could do. He gave up his authority and power, and he came to her as one of her own in the form of a peasant, so that he could know for sure if she did in fact love him. And that's what C.S. Lewis is getting at when he says that God cannot ravish, he can merely woo. It's often asked why the evidence for God is not more overwhelming. And the reason is because the evidence would not change people's feelings about God's character, but only his existence. And the last thing that God wants is people subserviently following him out of fear. Dawkins goes on to give Bertrand Russell's parable of the celestial teapot, which struck home for me because I'm a big fan of Reddit and have been a contributor to the Atheism column there. And their banner for the Atheism forum is Bertrand Russell's celestial teapot. And if you're not familiar with the fairly famous story, I'll read it in brief. It says, "Many Orthodox people speak as though it was the business of skeptics to disprove received dogmas rather than the dogmatists to prove them. This is, of course, a mistake. If I were to suggest that between the Earth and Mars there's a china teapot revolving about the sun in an elliptical orbit, no one would be able to disprove my assertion, provided I were careful to add that the teapot is too small to be revealed even by our most powerful telescopes. But if I were to go on to say that since my assertion cannot be disproved, it is an intolerable presupposition on the part of the human reason to doubt it, I should rightly be thought to be talking nonsense. If, however, the existence of such a teapot were affirmed in ancient books taught as sacred truth every Sunday and instilled into the minds of children in school, hesitation to believe its existence would become a mark of eccentricity and entitle the doubter to the attentions of a psychiatrist in an enlightened age or the inquisitor in an earlier time." The difference with Bertrand's teapot and the existence of God is that even though you can't observe the teapot, the rocket that launched it into orbit would be a verifiable historic event. There would be evidence of how it got there. So even though the teapot itself cannot be measured, its fingerprint on human history could be verified. In much the same way that God's interaction with Israel was historical, and Jesus' entry into earth happened at a particular time and place in history, verifiable or disprovable by historic facts. Also, unlike an inanimate teapot, God has chosen to communicate with us and authenticated that message with hundreds of prophecies. So you have Old Testament writers verifiably writing hundreds of years before Jesus' birth, forecasting accurately where he would be born, when he would live, how he would die. So there is a huge difference between Russell's inanimate teapot and the existence of God. Dawkins goes on, a philosophical favorite of his is the invisible, intangible, inaudible unicorn disproof, which is attempted yearly by the children at Camp Quest, which is a camp that, well, first let me say this. It's very interesting, to put it politely, and quite hypocritical, to put it bluntly. That Dawkins spends an entire chapter devoted to why children should not be taught their parents' viewpoints or coerced to believe one position over the other when they are children. But then he turns around and supports Camp Quest, who, according to their own website, states one of their objectives as to demonstrate atheism and humanism as a positive, family-friendly worldview. So it's quite interesting that when religious people share their values with their children, that is an atrocity, according to Dawkins. But when he does it, endorses it, pays for it, and promotes it, is perfectly acceptable. So here's a little bit of blindness in Richard's position to not see Now, he goes on to say, did Jesus have a human father, or was his mother a virgin at the time of his birth? Whether or not there is enough surviving evidence to decide it, it is still a strictly scientific question with a definitive answer in the yes or no. Did Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead? Did he himself come alive again 3 days after he was crucified? There is an answer to every such question, whether or not we can discover it in practice, and it is a strictly scientific answer. But science can only comment on what it can measure. So science can take an embryo today and say if there is evidence of a sperm and an egg, but it cannot comment on Mary's embryo. Joan of Arc did extraordinary things during her lifetime. Can science say if there was anything special about Joan of Arc's embryo? Well, no, because she was burned at the stake and there's no evidence for science to study. So if science cannot comment on Joan of Arc's conception a few hundred years ago, why on earth would Richard think that it could say anything about Mary's conception of Jesus 2,000 years ago? It just doesn't logically follow. One interesting thing that science could comment on would be the Shroud of Turin. So here we have a piece of physical evidence that science could analyze and comment on. And in the one area where science could offer us some insight, it can do nothing to disprove it. The Discovery Channel did a hour-long program on the Shroud of Turin where it was analyzed by a scientific forensic team to see if the image purportedly of Jesus was a forgery, and no evidence was found of any paint pigmentation on the image. In fact, the scientists analyzing the garment's conclusion was that the image appeared to be formed by radiation exposure, a type of radiation that they did not have the technology to reproduce in that day and age that the shroud came into existence. So on the one area where science can make a meaningful comment, it cannot disprove something that seems like it might validate the resurrection. But it certainly cannot comment on an empty tomb. And that's the bottom line, is that Dawkins goes too far in suggesting that we can look at events as they are today and make definitive conclusions that, well, they must have been that way 2,000 years ago because they couldn't possibly have been any other way. This makes this interesting statement that science can chip away at agnosticism. And interestingly enough, what he means is that for the agnostic that is not leaning toward atheism, that in Dawkins' view, science can push him toward that. But the interesting thing is that in reality, science can compel the open-minded inquisitor more toward a belief in faith. Because only in light of modern science can we now fully understand how precisely designed our solar system is. Or can we now fully understand the unbelievable complexity of a single cell in a way that would have blown Darwin's mind to know the detail in a single cell and how incredibly unlikely that would be formed by chance. Or the whole process of abiogenesis and how scientists have tried for decades to recreate the spontaneous origin of life unsuccessfully. So as we understand more about the universe, science does chip away at agnosticism, not as Dawkins would suggest in driving us toward atheism, but in realizing that science cannot offer us a universe devoid of a need for an explanation or a God. Now, the final comment here in chapter 2, it says, whether we know about them or not, they're very probably alien civilizations that are superhuman, to the point of being godlike in ways that exceed anything a theologian could possibly imagine. Their technical achievements would seem as supernatural to us as ours would seem to a Dark Age peasant transported to the 1st century. As Arthur C. Clarke put it, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So what is interesting here is that Dawkins is completely open to the idea of aliens that are God-like, just not open to the idea of God. He can accept an alien God. In fact, he even says he thinks it is probable, but remains completely closed off to an eternal God. So again, the question becomes, for someone that believes the universe could possibly be designed by a superior alien, and yet adamantly convinced that it could not have been designed by God, is that a conclusion based on evidence or an emotional decision?